Bort's Life of a Medieval Court Jester, the loneliest man in the castle. Hey guys, tonight, we're diving into the strange, sad, and surprisingly dangerous world of a man whose job was to make everyone else laugh, but whose own life was anything but funny. That's right, we're talking about the medieval court jester. You know the image, the floppy hat with bells, the garish outfit, the ridiculous jokes. It all sounds like fun and games, until you realize that one wrong punchline could land you in the dungeon or worse. So, before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of storytelling. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? It's always wild to see how far this little digital tavern of ours reaches. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or a candle for that soft hum, and let's slip back in time together. You don't become a jester, you get drafted into it. So, you want to be a jester, bad news. You don't get to want that. No one sets out to become a jester. You don't apply for the role, and you definitely don't go to school for it. Being a jester isn't a career choice, it's something that happens to you, like the flu or quicksand. Most jesters didn't grow up dreaming of performing tricks in front of half-sober barons. They were picked because something about them stood out physically, mentally, socially. Maybe you had a hunchback, a limp, a squeaky voice. Maybe you were shorter than average, or just wildly eccentric. Maybe you made one noble laugh at the wrong moment. And the next morning, boom, you're not in your peasant shack anymore. You're in the castle. Someone's tossing you a hat with bells on it and telling you, be funny forever. Some people were even bought. Yep, bought. Collected like exotic birds or strange goblets. If you were clever or weird enough, you might be gifted from one court to another, like some sarcastic party favor. Once you're chosen, you belong to the court. The second someone in power decided you were entertaining, that was it. Your personality got conscripted. You became the living laugh track for a court full of overfed, politically tense aristocrats. You weren't allowed to say no. You couldn't walk away. There was no quitting. Refuse to perform. You'd be back on the streets or in the stocks faster than you could say knock knock. In the medieval world, if you didn't have a land deed, a title, or a clearly defined purpose, you were just another mouth breathing invaluable air. That made you suspicious, arrestable, disposable. So no, being a jester wasn't a role. It was a life sentence. You lived in the castle, sure, but not like a prince, more like a pet. Always on stage, even when you're not. Being a jester wasn't a 9-to-5 gig. You didn't clock out and relax in a jester break room. From the moment you stepped into the hallways of the court, you were being watched. Every twitch, every eyebrow raise, every time you stretched or scratched your nose, someone was waiting for the joke. You couldn't just exist. You had to entertain. If you passed the queen's table at supper, you'd better give a wink or do a dramatic bow. Sit quietly in a corner for 5 seconds, and suddenly someone's whispering, "Why isn't the fool being foolish?" And God forbid you show any real emotion. Sadness, that makes people uncomfortable. Anger, dangerous. Thoughtful silence. That's just plain suspicious. If you weren't smiling like a deranged mascot while half dancing on one foot, they assumed you were plotting something. The costume wasn't for fun, it was for control. Let's talk about the outfit for a second. That ridiculous jester costume, the floppy horned hat with bells, the patchwork tunic that looked like a child's nightmare. It wasn't just for aesthetics, it was designed to humiliate. From the moment you stepped into the court, wearing that checkerboard mess of clashing colors, everyone knew exactly what you were, not a person, but a punchline. The bells weren't to help your performance, they were so people could hear you coming, like an animal with a tracking collar. Your shoes had curled toes and more bells. Your belt was knotted so impractically that carrying a pouch or weapon was out of the question. And while nobles strutted around in velvet, silk, and gold, your clothes were made from cheap scraps. If it was itchy hot and made you look like a coloring book exploded, that was perfect. This wasn't fashion, it was a uniform of humiliation. You lived in the palace, but not like the nobles. Technically, you lived in the palace, but don't imagine a plush chamber with a 4-poster bed and servants. Your room was probably a closet near the kitchen or a corner near the servants' quarters, close enough to hear the laughter from the feasts, but never be invited to join in. At meals, you didn't sit with the nobles. You hovered near them, performing on demand. You might eat from the same trays, but only after the priests, the guards, the dogs, and sometimes the stable boy had their fill. You were tolerated, not respected. You weren't trusted by the nobles because you were too lowly. You weren't trusted by the servants because you were too close to power. You were stranded between worlds, too weird to fit in with either. You were everyone's target and nobody's friend. Here's the thing. Nobles couldn't insult each other openly. Too risky, too political. But they could insult you, the jester, all day long. And they did. You were a pressure valve for their frustration. Had a bad hunting trip, call in the jester. Wine cellars late, summon the fool. Someone's favorite falcon flew into a wall, drag you out at midnight and say fix it. People pulled your hat down over your face, made you impersonate other nobles, laughed hardest when you tripped or dropped something. Your success wasn't measured by your skill. It was measured by how much you could be mocked without flinching. Even when you nailed a joke or performed a flawless satire that would make Cicero weep, the response was the same. Do the funny face again. You were the emotional air freshener of the court. You weren't just there for entertainment. You were there to manage the emotional temperature of the room. The king's dog sneezes. Everyone looks at you. The trade agreement falls apart. Must be your fault. Someone drops a goblet. Maybe the fool's lost his charm. You were the court's emotional scapegoat. If things were going wrong, your head was first on the chopping block. And you weren't allowed to have a bad day because the king's mood was your responsibility. They expected you to read the room, lighten the mood, and if things got tense, well, time for a juggling routine. Or maybe a pratfall. Anything to distract the nobles from the fact that someone just threatened war in the middle of the dessert course. And if you failed, you weren't getting a warning. You were getting whipped, or fired, or replaced. Or if you offended the wrong person, executed. Because being unfunny in a medieval court, that was practically treason. You had to be brilliant, but never let anyone know. The irony of being a jester is that you probably were the smartest person in the room. You had to be. You wrote satire, composed rhyming verse, played instruments, memorized court gossip, and knew exactly when to push and when to hold back. But if you ever shone too brightly, you were in trouble. Nobles didn't like being upstaged, especially by someone dressed like a garish Christmas ornament. If you told a better joke than the Duke, you were disrespectful. If you sang better than the Baron, you were too theatrical. Your goal was to be brilliant, but only just enough. You had to sparkle, not blind. It was a tightrope walk. Be sharp, but not dangerous. Be clever, but not threatening. Be insightful, then immediately juggle a turnip to make sure no one took you too seriously. Part 2. The Jester's Curse, Trapped in Laughter, Forgotten in Death. Now, let's get into the real tragedy of being a medieval court jester. It's not just that your job was exhausting, humiliating, and dangerous. It's that even when you were brilliant, truly brilliant, no one ever gave you credit for it. Your genius was treated like a party trick, something to pass the time before the roast goose showed up. You could spend days crafting a clever rhyme in Latin, one that made subtle jabs at the bishop's spending habits. You'd deliver it flawlessly during the feast. The room would roar. And then someone would throw a grape at your head and shout, "Dance, fool!" They didn't see a writer. They saw a wind-up toy with legs. That's the thing. The jester wasn't allowed to be seen as an artist or a thinker, or even a person. You could be razor-sharp, dangerously clever, but the moment you outshined someone important, you became a problem. They didn't want you to be respected. They wanted you to be amusing and harmless. They only really laugh when you fail. Here's what really hurts. The loudest laughs always came when you messed up. Trip mid-dance, miss a note, drop your juggling pins. That's when the nobles howled. Not because they appreciated the performance, but because your failure confirmed what they already wanted to believe, that you were just an idiot in a funny hat. They didn't laugh with you, they laughed at you. And the twisted part is, you knew that. So you had to turn your mistakes into jokes, your pain into punchlines. Because if you didn't, they'd lose interest. Or worse, they'd feel uncomfortable, and in a medieval court, uncomfortable nobles could get you killed. So, you leaned into it. You became the clown. You made your clumsiness part of the act. You turned your heartbreak into comedy. You laughed first, so they wouldn't laugh last. It was the only way to survive. At feasts, you were the main course of mockery. Now, let's talk about feasts. If you think being a jester meant you got to enjoy those big royal banquets with music, wine, and candlelight, think again. You weren't at the table. You hovered around it, orbiting like a brightly colored moon of misery. You were there to fill in awkward silences, make nobles laugh at each other's expense, and pretend like it didn't hurt when someone pulled your hat down over your eyes or made you do a pig impression in front of the queen. Feasts were brutal, not because of the food, but because of what they turned you into. You were a moving target, a living plaything. Nobles would toss bones at you, you make you perform degrading little tricks just to amuse their guests. And you had to do it with a smile, because if you didn't, they'd say, "Why isn't the fool being foolish?" And then the guards might come knocking. You were always welcome at the feast, but never as a guest. Always as a spectacle. By night, you were a spy in disguise. Now, here's where things get really interesting. By day you were a clown, but by night you were something else entirely. You were a listener, a watcher, a spy in plain sight. Because you were everywhere, you were allowed into rooms others weren't. You poured wine for diplomats. You stood in the shadows during tense meetings. You danced through political discussions and eavesdropped while pretending to tune your lute. And nobody stopped talking around you, because they didn't think you mattered. You were the fool. You weren't a threat. But you heard everything's affairs, betrayals, alliances. And that information, that was your real power. The king might call you into his chamber and say, "Fool, what did the bishop whisper to the French envoy?" And you'd better have the answer. Because if you didn't, he might suspect you're loyal to someone else. So, you told him. Maybe in a riddle, maybe in a song, maybe in a joke wrapped around a pun wrapped around a half-truth. Because that's the line you walked. The king wanted truth, but only the kind of truth that didn't offend him. And in a court full of secrets, truth was the sharpest blade of all. But that blade cuts both ways. Everyone knew you were dangerous, not with a sword, but with your words. So they laughed, and smiled, and pretended not to be scared. But behind closed doors they whispered, "Don't say too much around the jester." Servants stopped talking when you walked by. Guards watched just like you might snap at any moment. And nobles, they kept their compliments vague and their smiles tight. Because they knew one wrong joke, one exposed affair, one political quip, too close to reality, and you could bring the whole castle down. You were the court's most dangerous informant, dressed like a joke, and everyone knew it. You weren't allowed to have feelings. Now let's talk about the emotional toll. Imagine waking up with a fever. Your back is sore from sleeping on a straw mat. Your dog died last night, and today's your birthday. But none of that matters, because the Duke had a bad hunting trip, and he's in a mood, and he needs a laugh. So, they call you. You walk into the hall. You feel like crying. But instead, you smile. You dance. You tell a joke about the bishop's wig, and everyone laughs. No one asks if you're okay. No one notices the shaking in your hands. They just say, "Ah, the fool's back on form." But what they don't realize is that every performance chips away at your soul. You don't get to be tired. You don't get to be heartbroken. You don't get to be human. Because if you stop being funny, they stop caring. And when they stop caring, they start replacing. So you bury it, all of it. The grief, the anger, the loneliness. You push it all down and juggle on. And the king, he owns your mood now. You think your boss is demanding. Try working for a medieval king. One bad dream, one burnt roast, one cough from a foreign diplomat, and the king's entire mood shifts. And guess whose fault it is? Yours. Doesn't matter that you've been performing non-stop for 3 days. Doesn't matter that your voice is hoarse or your ankles twisted. If the king isn't smiling, everyone looks at you. You there, fool, do something amusing. And that's not a suggestion, that's an order. Because in that court, your job wasn't just to be funny. Your job was to be the emotional thermostat for the entire ruling class. Tensions rising. Better do a pratfall. Queen scowling. Time for a riddle. The prince is drunk and angry. Tell a joke before he tells the guards to drag you out. You were the glue holding the royal ego together, and if it cracked, you were the first to bleed. No exit, no legacy, no farewell. And here's the cruelest part. You could spend your whole life serving the court. Decades of jokes, songs, humiliations. You could keep secrets that would ruin kingdoms, ease tensions that saved lives, deliver joy to people who wouldn't know joy otherwise. And when you died, nothing. No grave marker, no poem, no history book. Maybe the cook remembers you. Hey, remember that fool who used to dance like a goat? Maybe a new jester finds your old hat stuffed in a drawer. Or maybe no one remembers you at all, because you weren't a person. You were a sound, a jingle, a flicker of amusement. And once that flicker fades, they just light another one. Press 3. The jester wasn't just a joke, he was a mirror. So here's the twist that nobody expects. The jester wasn't just there to be laughed at. He was there to make you look at yourself. Yeah, that goofy man in the rainbow rags and the jingling bells. He was the only one in the room who could say what everyone else was too scared to admit. That the king was a hypocrite, that the bishop was greedy, that the whole court was drowning in lies, vanity, and bad wine. He was a mirror, a walking contradiction, powerless, and yet terrifying. And that's why he was so important. Because in a world built on rigid hierarchy where every word was calculated, every smile, a strategy, the jester was the only one who could say what he really thought. Or at least, make it sound like a joke. The joke was never just a joke. Let's say the kingdom just lost a battle. Everyone's walking on eggshells. The generals are blaming each other. The king is brooding. The queen's pretending not to cry. And then the jester strolls in and says, "Well, at least now we know how fast our knights can run, especially in the wrong direction." People laugh, because it's funny, but also because it's true and uncomfortable. And that's the point. A good jester didn't just tell jokes. He crafted them like weapons, layered them with double meanings, wrapped truth in satire like a poison hidden in cake. He could call out corruption, incompetence, or cruelty, but only if he did it while juggling, or rhyming, or wearing shoes with bells on the toes. And if he was too obvious, too pointed, that same joke could get him executed. So, he walked the razor's edge between honesty and offense, humor and humiliation. He wasn't just a clown. He was a performer, a strategist, and sometimes the only voice of reason in the whole palace. The line between wit and death was always moving. And here's what made it truly terrifying. The rules kept changing. On Monday, you joke about the Queen's cousin's gambling problem. She laughs. On Tuesday, he's sitting next to her, and now it's treason. On Wednesday, she laughs again too loudly. Now the king's offended. By Thursday, you're being escorted out by guards for disturbing courtly decorum. That line between clever and disrespectful, it moved every day, depending on the mood, the wine, the politics, or the weather. So as a jester, you had to read the room like your life depended on it, because it did. You had to know when to push, when to pull back, when to layer your truth and metaphor so thick it sounded like nonsense to the untrained ear. You weren't just performing, you were surviving. When truth is too sharp, even a fool can't say it. Some jesters developed a whole language of metaphor and absurdity to get their messages across. They'd say things like, "The rooster with the loudest crow has no eggs, and should maybe keep his beak shut at dawn." Sounds silly, right? But if the king had just been publicly mocked and everyone was talking about it behind his back, well, that line suddenly hits different. But even that wasn't always safe. Because if the wrong person connected the dots, you weren't a truth teller anymore. You were an instigator, a problem, a threat. And in the court, threats didn't get warnings. They got silenced. Some jesters were banished, others were whipped, some were just never seen again. Because even if your jokes had layers of genius in them, if they exposed too much truth too clearly, you were reminding the powerful of something they hated to admit, that they were being watched, that they weren't untouchable, that even a man in bells could hold up a mirror they couldn't laugh away. And when that mirror shattered, so did you. The moment they stopped laughing, you were done. Because laughter was your armor. As long as they found you amusing, you were protected. You were tolerated. You were useful. But the second that stopped, you weren't funny anymore. You were dangerous. And no one in power keeps a threat in their dining hall. So you had to keep smiling, keep dancing, keep being just smart enough to be valuable, but never so smart that they started looking at you like a weapon. It was emotional hostage-taking with a smile, a performance under pressure where the stage was rigged and the audience could kill you. You lived with the nobles, but you were never one of them. Let's make this clear. You lived in the palace. You knew every corridor. You heard every secret. You watched kings rise and fall, queens cry in silence, and knights betray their oaths. But you were never one of them. You weren't invited to weddings. You weren't asked your opinion. You weren't celebrated in poems. You were a part of the furniture, like a tapestry that moved, a noise that jingled, a tool that told jokes. You were close enough to power to feel the heat, but never close enough to hold any of it. And when you were no longer amusing, they didn't thank you. They didn't remember you. They just replaced you. And when you died, the world moved on. Your death wouldn't make headlines. It wouldn't even make whispers. Maybe the cook mentions you once. Remember that fool who used to do that goose impression. Maybe someone finds your old hat stuffed in a trunk and chuckles. Or maybe no one says anything at all. Because when your life is built on laughter that isn't yours, when your legacy is to be forgettable on purpose, there's no eulogy, just silence. You made everyone else feel alive, but you vanished like smoke. That's the cruelest irony. You were everywhere, and then gone. The final punchline wasn't yours. In the end, the joke wasn't on the nobles. It was on you. You sacrificed dignity, privacy, identity, and freedom for the fleeting joy of people who saw you as less than human. Your genius was hidden under slapstick. Your pain was buried beneath punchlines. your name erased by the next man in bells. You walk the halls like a ghost before you even died. Because once you're the fool, you stay the fool. Part 4. The Ancient Roots of Performance, Before the Curtain Ever Rose. So, we've spent a lot of time talking about jesters, those tragic performers stuck between laughter and survival in medieval courts. But if you zoom out a bit, you start to see something even bigger. Because the jester isn't just a medieval curiosity. He's part of something ancient, something deeply human. The need to perform, to make meaning, to speak truths through stories, gestures, masks, and music. Long before there were scripts, theaters, or even a word for actor, people were already performing. And the line between ritual and performance, it didn't exist. Let's rewind way back thousands of years. Back before Shakespeare, before Rome, before even the Greeks. Back to a place where theater wasn't a job. It was a sacred act. It all began with a god named Dionysus. Our story starts in ancient Greece, but not with statues or scholars. No, it starts with wine, with madness, with masks, and with a god named Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of wine, fertility, ritual, ecstasy, and theater. Yeah, theater had its own god. That's how seriously the Greeks took it. Every spring, Athens held a massive festival. In his honor, the city Dionysia. It was part religious ceremony, part street party, and part talent show for the ages. People came from all over. There were parades. There were sacrifices. Wine flowed like rivers. And right in the middle of it all, people started performing. Not casually, not shyly, fully transformed. Choruses of men with painted faces and flowing robes would sing wild hymns called dithyrambs, chanting stories of gods, heroes, betrayal, and grief. It was loud, chaotic, spiritual, and beautiful. They weren't just telling stories, they were becoming them. And then one day around 534 BCE, a man named Thespis stepped out from the chorus and spoke as a character. He didn't say Zeus did this. He said, "I am Zeus." Boom, the first actor. That's why we still call performers thespians. Greek theater was a mirror held up to the polis. Once Thespis cracked that door open, the Greeks sprinted through it. What began as ritual turned into structure. Writers like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides developed full plays, dialogue, conflict character arcs. These weren't just performances, they were national events. Greek theater was public, political, and emotional. Everyone showed up, citizen slaves, even the poor. Rich patrons paid for the productions as a form of civic duty. And the theater's massive, carved into hillsides. The theater of Dionysus in Athens could hold up to 17,000 people. That's bigger than most NBA arenas. The plays tackled everything: fate, justice, love, revenge, war, pride, madness. The Greeks used theater the way we use the internet to argue, to cry, to laugh, to question everything. And always they wore masks. The mask wasn't a disguise, it was revelation. In Greek theater, masks were everything. They weren't just props, they were symbols, tools of transformation. Oversized, stylized, exaggerated expressions carved into wood or molded from linen and resin. Each one captured a single emotion: grief, joy, rage, fear. From the back row, you could still feel what the character was feeling. One actor could play 3 different roles just by switching masks. A god in one scene, a peasant in the next, a betrayed wife in the third. And behind that mask, the voice did the heavy lifting. There were no microphones, no lights, just human sound echoing across the stone. Greek actors didn't act the way we think of it, they embodied. They weren't trying to be realistic. They were trying to be true. Tragedy wasn't sad, it was sacred. Let's pause here and talk about tragedy. Today we think of tragedy as something sad. Back then it meant something much deeper. The word itself, tragoidia, means goat song. Why? Possibly because goats were sacrificed during early rituals. Possibly because the prize for the best tragedy was a goat. Either way, it's weirdly poetic. Greek tragedies were full of doom, fate you couldn't escape, gods who toyed with mortals, characters like Oedipus who tries to avoid a prophecy and accidentally fulfills it, blinding himself in horror once he realizes. But the point wasn't just to make people cry, the point was catharsis, to purge emotion, to feel deeply, safely, collectively. The Greeks believed that by watching these stories unfold, watching pride lead to downfall, love to betrayal, truth to destruction, we were learning how to live, or at least, how not to. And then came comedy, wild, loud and political. Of course you can't have tragedy without comedy, and Greek comedy was wild. Where tragedy was structured and poetic comedy was messy, rude, loud, and deeply satirical. Enter Aristophanes, the OG of satire. Think Jon Stewart, but in a tunic and laurel crown. His plays roasted everyone, politicians, philosophers, generals, the gods. He even made fun of Socrates, and some say that play helped get Socrates killed. Comedies like Lysistrata, where women go on a sex strike to stop a war, weren't just funny, they were revolutionary. And again, Mask's music chorus chaos. Theater wasn't entertainment, it was engagement. The whole city talking to itself in riddles and punchlines. Rome took the stage and cranked it to 11. Then the Romans came along and said, "Cool idea, Greece. Now let's make it louder." Roman theater borrowed everything from the Greeks' tragedy comedy structure, but turned it into a spectacle. Massive amphitheaters, flashy staging, actors in giant masks performing for 10,000 people at a time, water effects, trapdoors, music so loud it drowned out the dialogue. Roman comedies, thanks to writers like Plautus and Terence, became fast-paced farces full of mistaken identity, dumb dads, clever slaves, and jokes about flatulence. But Roman tragedy, that was dark, really dark. Seneca's Thyestes has a scene where a man eats his own children. Yikes. Still, for most Romans, the theater was the pre-show. The real draw, gladiator fights, chariot races, executions. So, playwrights adapted. They had to compete with blood and chaos. Drama got louder, gorier, less sacred, more sensational. In Rome, theater became politics, propaganda, performance as power. India had a different vision, theater as enlightenment. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, something completely different was blooming. In ancient India, theater wasn't a spectacle. It was a sacred science. The foundation was a text called the Natya Shastra, a 2,000-year-old manual that lays out everything: staging, gestures, music, makeup, emotions. It's incredibly detailed, like down to how you should move your eyebrow to convey curiosity. But the heart of it all is rasa, the emotional flavors a performance should evoke: love, valor, compassion, anger, fear, wonder, peace. The idea was simple. A good play doesn't just entertain you, it transforms you. It guides your soul toward harmony. Performances were deeply spiritual. Actors trained for years. And the stories came from epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana myths, packed with drama wisdom and the occasional flying monkey god. Here, theater wasn't a mirror of society. It was a path to truth. Let's pause here. So what do we have so far? In Greece, theater began as religious ecstasy and became democratic reflection. In Rome, it evolved into propaganda and mass entertainment. In India, it blossomed into spiritual philosophy. Different cultures, different rules, but always the same heartbeat. We perform to understand ourselves. We put on masks to reveal the truth. We become someone else to understand who we really are. That's what the Jester inherited. That's what he stood on. Not just a fool in funny clothes, but a descendant of Dionysus, of Thespis, of the chorus, of the ritual. And whether he was dancing for nobles or bleeding on the inside behind a joke, he was continuing an ancient tradition. A tradition that said, you can't kill the truth, not as long as someone's brave enough to laugh at it. Part 5. Theater as Silence, Ritual, and Spirit, the Eastern Stage. All right, we've seen how ancient Greece gave us tragedy and catharsis. Rome gave us spectacle, and India gave us theater as spiritual awakening. But now, let's head farther east into a world where theater isn't loud or flashy. It's quiet, still, controlled, and yet somehow even more powerful. Welcome to the stage of ancient China and medieval Japan, where every movement means something, and silence speaks louder than applause. China, where movement was meaning, and the stage was sacred. The roots of Chinese theater go back more than 3,000 years. Before there were scripts and dialogue, there were shamans, court performers, ritual dancers in elaborate robes, performing ceremonies meant to keep spirits at bay or invite divine blessings. In the Zhou dynasty, dancers wore nuo masks, fearsome, bright, almost supernatural. These weren't for fun. They were part of a spiritual performance meant to purify, protect, and connect the human world to the divine. Over time, storytelling crept into these performances. Dance met drama, music met mime, and eventually theater as we know it took shape. The Tang Dynasty, birthplace of professional actors. By the 7th century CE, during the Tang Dynasty, Chinese theater became more than ritual, it became art, a full-fledged craft. Emperor Xuanzong even founded the Pear Garden, a royal training academy for dancers, actors, and musicians. It was basically the Juilliard of the East. To this day, professional Chinese actors are still called children of the Pear Garden. Performers learned how to move, sing, fight, cry, all in highly stylized forms. Nothing was improvised. Everything was precise. If you raised your hand a little too fast or tilted your head at the wrong moment, the whole meaning of the scene could collapse. This was theater not as imitation, but as discipline. Yuan Dynasty, when the stories got bold. Then came the Yuan Dynasty around the 13th century, and with it a creative explosion. Confucian censorship loosened under Mongol rule, and theater took a wild turn. Suddenly, plays were tackling corruption, injustice, heartbreak, betrayal, and the man leading the charge, Guan Hanqing, sometimes called the Chinese Shakespeare. His most famous play, The Injustice to Do Yi, is about a woman wrongly accused, tortured, and executed, but not before she curses the heavens, predicting snow in summer as a sign of her innocence. The play is haunting, poetic, and deeply political. Theater in this era wasn't just ritual, it became resistance. From this came Chinese opera, a visual symphony. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, Chinese theater evolved into opera, a rich layered art form that blended voice, dance, color, and combat. The most famous version is Peking opera, or Jingju, and if you've never seen it, picture this. An actor in a robe covered in embroidered dragons, a mask painted in elaborate codes of red and black, performing martial arts, moves time to gongs, with a falsetto voice piercing through a sea of cymbals. There are no props, no backdrops, no realism. But when the actor steps forward, raises a sleeve, and lowers his gaze, you don't need words. You know something sacred is happening. That's the power of Chinese theater. It doesn't just tell a story, it embodies it. Japan's No Theater, drama in a whisper. Now, let's glide across the sea to Japan, where theater evolved along a very different path, one rooted in stillness, restraint, and ritualized beauty. Here in the 14th century, two men changed the world of performance forever, Kanami and his son, Zimi. They didn't invent No theater, but they refined it, elevated it, turned it into one of the most elegant and mysterious art forms in history. What is No? No is not theater in the Western sense. There are no fast-paced plots, no jokes, no monologues. It's more like a moving meditation. Imagine an actor moving slowly, very slowly across a wooden stage. He wears an ancient kimono and a hand-carved mask. A flute whines in the background. Drums pulse slow and deliberate. He speaks a line not loudly, but like a prayer, and with just a shift of his head, the entire mask seems to change expression. Joy, grief, madness, longing. No plays are often about spirits, ghosts, lost souls trapped between worlds, a dead samurai, a grieving mother, a goddess watching over a burning village. Everything is symbolic, nothing is explained. You don't watch No to understand. You watch it to feel. The philosophy of Yugen. Zimi, the great No theorist, described the heart of the form using the word Yugen. It's hard to translate, but it means something like mysterious grace, a profound subtlety, a beauty that hides beneath the surface. And that's what No aims to do, not to dazzle you, but to draw you inward, to slow your breathing, to make you quiet enough to hear your own soul respond. In No, less is more. Stillness is drama. Silence is the loudest line. It was supported by the samurai class. It wasn't entertainment for peasants, it was a sacred art for the elite. Something to watch once in a lifetime. Something to remember forever. Japanese puppet theater, where it all speak truth. But Japan didn't stop with No. It also gave rise to bunraku, one of the most astonishing theatrical traditions in the world. And yes, it's puppet theater, but not the kind you're thinking of. Bunraku puppets are 2 to 4 feet tall, operated by 3 people. One moves the head and right arm. One moves the left arm. One moves the legs. It takes 10 years just to qualify to touch the puppet's head. And the puppeteers are on stage, in full view, dressed in black, ignored by the audience. The voice. All the dialogue. Every line is spoken by a single narrator seated at the side of the stage, accompanied by a 3-stringed instrument called the shamisen. One voice, dozens of characters. Every emotion from rage to heartbreak, channeled through puppets more expressive than many human actors. And somehow, it works. It works so well that sometimes the audience weeps. Not for the man speaking or the puppeteer, but for the puppet. The wooden doll with the painted face and silk kimono. Because in bunraku, the puppet isn't just a doll. It's the truth unfiltered. Why puppets matter. You see this again across Asia, in India, in Indonesia, in Vietnam. Puppets became a way to say what humans couldn't, to tell forbidden stories, to mock the emperor, to speak of war and betrayal and loss without punishment. Because after all, it's just a puppet, right? Wrong. Puppets are mirrors. They don't have egos. They don't have agendas. They reflect what we project onto them. They're the most honest actors in the world. Performance as philosophy, not product. So if you're noticing a theme here, it's that in the East Theater wasn't just for the crowd. It was for the soul. It wasn't about selling tickets. It was about achieving balance between movement and stillness, between sound and silence, between actor and audience. In Chinese and Japanese traditions, performance was more than storytelling. It was a ritual, a meditation, a sacred conversation between the visible and invisible worlds. And every time the flute sounded, every time the mask turned slightly toward the light, it reminded people that art isn't about noise. It's about presence. Let's pause before we move west again. So what have we seen? In the East, theater became a vessel for harmony, for healing, for hidden truths. No bright lights, no cheering crowds, just controlled movement, symbolic color, and centuries of discipline. And here's what's wild, it's still happening. No and Bunraku are still performed today. Peking opera still dazzles. And their influence has reached into modern film dance and even virtual avatars. The theater hasn't vanished. It's just changed shape. The spirit behind it still breathing. Part 6. Theater in the Shadows. Subversion, resistance, and survival. So far, we've explored palaces and temples, masks and myths, sacred stages and state-funded dramas. But what about the performances that weren't welcomed? The ones whispered in back rooms, staged in candlelit corners, or acted out in front of people who couldn't afford tickets? What about theater in the shadows? Because while kings were watching grand tragedies and priests were sponsoring spiritual plays, there were others, peasants, rebels, dreamers telling stories too. Quietly, boldly, and sometimes dangerously. Let's go there now to the margins, where the theater didn't just entertain, it survived. The puppet as protest, Indonesia's wayang kulit. Let's start in Southeast Asia with Indonesia's wayang kulit. It's one of the oldest continuously performed theatrical traditions on Earth. And it doesn't use actors, it uses shadows, literally. Wayang kulit is shadow puppetry. Intricately carved leather figures held up against a white screen with a flickering oil lamp behind them. The result? A hypnotic dance of silhouettes. But it's not just beautiful, it's powerful. The puppeteer called the dalang is more than a performer. He's a master, a priest, a philosopher, and sometimes a political commentator. These plays often draw from the Ramayana or Mahabharata, ancient Indian epics, but woven into them are jokes about corrupt officials, critiques of colonialism, even commentary on modern politics. And because it's all done through shadows and riddles and sacred language censors often didn't catch it. The people did though. They understood. In Java and Bali, when governments changed, when regimes cracked down, wayang kept going. Underground, mobile, eternal. Subversive stages of Europe, when theater got dangerous. Let's cross back over to Europe for a second. Because during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, theater wasn't always legal. In England, under strict Puritan rule, public theaters were banned, literally closed, actors arrested, playhouses torn down. But theater didn't die, it ducked. Performers went rural. Small troupes would travel from village to village, putting on comedies in barns or marketplaces, pretending to be moral educators, while actually telling thinly veiled jokes about church scandals or noble idiocy. And then there were the commedia dell'arte, troupes of Italy. These were wandering groups of actors, men and women, who performed unscripted comedies using masks, archetypes, and improvisation. Think the sly servant, the pompous merchant, the lovesick poet, the scheming old woman. They were chaotic, physical, political, hilarious. And because they used stock characters and gibberish-sounding language, they could slip satire right under the radar. Commedia wasn't just theater. It was street rebellion in costume. The carnival stage, when the world turned upside down. Then there's Carnival, that annual explosion of masks, music and mockery that spread across Europe and Latin America. During Carnival, everything flipped. Servants dressed like kings, women dressed like bishops. The poor mocked the rich. The jester became the ruler. It was theater with no stage. The whole town was the performance. And yes, it was fun, but it was also political therapy. For 1 week a year, the powerless got to pretend they were in control. They got to laugh at the people who usually had their boots on their necks. And everyone knew it was pretend, but that pretending it kept real revolution at bay. For a while, anyway. Theater, in this case, wasn't just subversion. It was a pressure valve. The secret stages of enslaved people. Now, let's shift to the darkest stages of all those built under oppression in places where performance could get you killed. During the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans in the Americas created their own performance traditions. Spirituals, ring shouts, call and response songs, coded dances. On the surface, it was music, religion, celebration. But underneath, communication, resistance. Songs held maps. Dances mimicked escape paths. Hymns disguised rebellion. And when enslaved people gathered at night away from white overseers, they didn't just pray, they performed. Stories of gods who overcame evil. Trickster figures like Anansi the spider, who used wit to outsmart the strong. It was theater as memory, as rebellion, as cultural survival. Because when everything else is stolen, your name, your land, your family story is what remains. Jewish theater in exile, Yiddish stages of survival. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Jewish communities constantly persecuted, expelled and blamed for everything. From plagues to politics built their own shadow theaters. Literally the Yiddish theater. It started in Purim plays comic performances during the Jewish holiday of Purim, retelling the book of Esther. But over time, it grew into full-blown traveling theater. Dramas, tragedies, musicals, even Shakespeare in Yiddish. These plays tackled everything identity exile, poverty assimilation, anti-Semitism. And sometimes, they performed in secret, behind butcher shops, in candlelit basements, in ghettos. Because again, theater was how they remembered who they were. When the world said, "You don't belong," the Yiddish stage replied, "We are still here." The ghosts of forbidden performers. Many of these shadow theaters didn't survive the 20th century. Wars destroyed them. Colonialism banned them. Industrialization forgot them. But sometimes, you still hear echoes. In a dusty archive, you'll find a puppet with burn marks on its handle. In a village, someone might still remember the man who used to tell stories, using only shadows and a candle. A wrinkled mask tucked into a chest, too delicate to wear, too sacred to throw away. They're not gone, just sleeping, waiting, because performance is survival. When we talk about theater, we often think about the spotlight. But real theater, it's in the corners, the alleys, the back rooms. It's the whispered monologue, the smuggled script, the child mouthing the lines of a play her grandmother taught her, long banned, never forgotten. It's resistance in rhythm, protest in parody. Theater doesn't need a stage. It needs a reason. And when people have been silenced, erased, or exiled, performance becomes the last weapon. A way of saying we still exist, we still feel, we still laugh. Even in the dark. Part 7. What We've Become. The stage in the age of the algorithm. So here we are. We've journeyed through sacred temples and royal courts, through underground puppet shows and shadow rituals. We've watched emperors laugh at fools and rebels whisper truth behind masks. We've seen that performance, real performance, isn't about fame or fame chasing. It's about identity, resistance, connection. But what about now? Because we don't sit in open-air theaters carved into stone hillsides anymore. We scroll, we stream, we swipe through thousands of performers, most of them unpaid acting for invisible audiences they'll never meet. Welcome to the modern stage. And it's not on a platform. It is the platform. The algorithm is the new audience. In the past, the performer's worst fear was silence. Now, it's the algorithm not noticing. You can be a genius, funny, poetic raw, and still go unseen if the numbers don't land. You're not performing for people anymore. You're performing for code, for engagement metrics, for seconds watched and likes tapped. And so, we start changing not because it's true, but because it performs. We say what might trend, not what we mean. We become digital jesters, pushing just far enough to catch attention, but never far enough to get punished by the system. Sound familiar? It should, because we're back to walking that razor's edge, the one the jester knew too well. Too boring and the crowd scrolls past. Too bold and the platform buries you. We're not on stage. We are the stage. Influencer is performer. The mask returns. Think about what an influencer really is, a carefully curated mask, a persona, the funny one, the wise one, the aesthetic minimalist, the chaotic traveler, the hot mess, the productivity guru. You play the character so often you start forgetting where it ends, and you begin. And just like the Greek chorus, your followers echo everything you say. They laugh when you laugh, cry when you cry. Turn your grief into memes, your anger into reaction, videos, your vulnerability into content. Isn't that theater? Worse, isn't that exploitation? Not by a cruel king or a church censor, but by a system that rewards attention more than truth. And you smile. You keep uploading because you can't afford to be forgotten. You've got merch to move. Even the fool is marketed now. Here's the kicker. Back then, the fool was a threat to power because he couldn't be bought. He was untamed, dangerous. Today, the fool is an ad campaign. The jester wears brand partnerships. He's not mocking the king. He's selling deodorant. His satire is corporate safe. His rebellion comes with a disclaimer. His chaos is optimized. And if he stops being funny, the algorithm stops showing him to people. Poof, vanished. The same fate as the court fool, just with cleaner lighting and better captions. But here's the hope. The old stage still echoes. Not everything is lost. Because even now, beneath the filters and follower counts, there are people still performing like it's sacred. They tell hard stories, make real art, sing without auto-tune, cry without cropping the frame. They do it in garages, in parks and basements, sometimes on TikTok, sometimes on a stage with a single working spotlight. They're modern shamans, digital griots, tech-savvy jesters whispering uncomfortable truths between trending audios. And yes, it's harder now. The algorithm doesn't want mystery. It wants clarity, emotion in 3 seconds, a hook in 5, a payoff by the 10-second mark or you're irrelevant. But somehow, the real ones still get through. They always do. Because performance, the kind that actually matters, can't be killed. It just changes costumes. The return of the mask, but not to hide. Ironically, the mask is back. We wear them online. Not physical ones, but curated identities. Avatars, handles, filters, personas. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Because masks, when used right, don't just hide. They reveal. That's what the Greeks believed. That's what the no actors trained for. That's what the jesters knew. Behind the mask, you could say what you really felt. You could speak the unspeakable. You could grieve, laugh, scream, without being punished for it. Maybe the digital age just gave us new kinds of masks. And maybe we can still use them to tell the truth. The eternal performance, and why it still matters. Let's not kid ourselves. We are still performers. You perform when you walk into a job interview, when you introduce yourself at a party, when you post a caption. You perform when you choose what to say, what to wear, how to react. We all do. And that's not fake. It's human. We've been performing since we first gathered around firelight, since we painted stories on cave walls, since we put on masks and danced so the rain would fall. Theater isn't a genre, it's not a luxury, it's a survival instinct. It's how we made sense of death, of power, of love, of exile, of betrayal, of God. It's how we told each other through centuries of chaos and cruelty. I see you, I feel it too. The stage has no walls anymore. Today the stage isn't just in theaters. It's in living rooms, bedrooms, browsers, feeds. And that means yes, you are a part of it. When you sing, when you speak, when you post something that's real, even if it doesn't perform, you're keeping the ritual alive. You're standing in the footsteps of Dionysus and Ziemi, of the jesters and the griots and the storytellers who refuse to go quiet. You are not just content. You are the continuation. So, if you ever feel invisible, like you're screaming into a void, while the algorithm hands the spotlight to someone else, remember this. Real performance was never about applause. It was about presence, witness, truth. And in a world that tries to flatten you into a number, being fully human, flawed, emotional, unpredictable, is the most sacred performance of all. Part 8. The final act. The story. You tell yourself about yourself. Let's stop for a second. Not to rewind, not to recap, but to really sit in the moment, right here, at the edge of everything we talked about. Because for all the masks we've worn, for all the stories we've acted out, there's one performance that never ends. One stage we never leave. It's not on YouTube. It's not in a theater. It's not even in your living room. It's in your mind. It's the performance you give to an audience of one you, the internal stage, where you're actor, writer, director, and critic. Every single day you wake up and tell yourself a story. About who you are, what you can do, what you're allowed to feel, what your past meant, what your future might hold. That story, it's not objective, it's a performance. A constructed narrative shaped by memory, trauma, hope, fear, and desire. And just like in theater, you hit your marks. You repeat your lines. You stay in character sometimes without realizing it. I'm the shy one. I always mess things up. I'm not good enough. Or maybe it's, I'm strong, no one can hurt me. I'm in control, I don't need help. Whatever it is, you're not just living it. You're rehearsing it over and over. The story becomes the self. The masks you forgot. You were wearing. You know what's tricky? We don't just wear masks for others. We wear them for ourselves. Sometimes we inherit them. A parent calls you lazy at 12, and suddenly that's your mask for life. Sometimes we build them. Trauma forces you to be funny or emotionless or invincible just to survive. And over time, you forget it's a performance. You think it's who you are. But deep down, you feel the friction. You feel it when you laugh too hard at a joke that cuts. When you hold back tears because strong people don't cry. When you say you're fine for the 1000th time and something inside you whispers liar. That voice, it's not weakness. It's truth trying to get a line in. What happens if you rewrite the script? Here's the terrifying, liberating truth. You can change the story. You're not stuck with the character you were handed. You're not bound to the plot you've been repeating. You can rewrite the script. It won't be easy. The original is familiar, comfortable, even if it's painful. But you can choose a new genre, a new theme, a new voice. You can say that wasn't the climax. That was just Act 2. You can say I'm not the sidekick. I'm the lead. You can say I'm not broken. I'm becoming. And yes, people might not recognize you. You might lose an audience or two. But the ones who stay, they'll be watching something real. Performance isn't the opposite of authenticity. Let's get something straight. Performance gets a bad rap. People think it means fake, shallow, inauthentic. But real performance, is intentional expression. It's deciding to tell your story with clarity, with emotion, with meaning. It's choosing how you move through the world, not being dragged by it. So if you start acting more confident, more vulnerable, more ambitious, it doesn't mean you're faking it. It means you're directing the scene. It means you've stopped letting fear write your lines. It means you're becoming a performer again. Not for likes, not for approval, but for yourself. The final curtain, and the echo that remains. Every performance ends. The curtain falls, the stage goes dark, the feed refreshes, the voice fades out. But what stays? The echo. The line that hit too close. The look that said everything without a word. The moment you saw yourself reflected in someone else and didn't flinch. That's what performance really is. A mirror, a ritual, a question thrown out into the void. Do you see me? And when it lands, when someone somewhere nods quietly from the shadows, something ancient stirs. We are still here. We are still human. We are still telling stories. So, here's yours. Now what? You don't need a stage. You don't need a spotlight. You don't even need permission. All you need is the courage to speak, to move, to reveal. To take off the mask when you're ready. Or put one on, not to hide, but to show what words can't. You are not a follower count. You are not your worst review. You are not the part of your story someone else tried to write for you. You are the storyteller. The stage is yours. The audience is listening. So, step forward and begin. Our story ends here. See you tomorrow evening. Good night. I love you.